Well, there's a saying in leadership and in business that says that the system that you have is perfectly designed for the results that you're getting. And I would say that that's 100% true. Matter of fact, if you're in sports or you're in a classroom or a bank or just in life, that's probably a good way to look at things. I mean, you look at your life and you say, okay, well, what got me here? And generally when you ask that question, it really is alluding to something else, though. It's really talking about the fact that you don't like the results that you're getting. You don't like where you are. There's some kind of frustration at some level with what you're seeing. And so you're trying to say, okay, evaluation, what is going on? And that works for business. Oftentimes it even works for families. It definitely works for a sports team, something like that. As we evaluate those things, it works in leadership in general. But honestly, when it comes to faith, it doesn't really capture, I think, the essence of what the answer really is. I think that honestly, when I deal with life, I talk to people, and I've been doing this in my profession for some time. A lot of times when I'm talking to people about their level of frustration with their faith, and a very real thing, that they're looking for a system to finish or to rectify the problem of their frustration, and it never really works. Matter of fact, depending on your temperament, your personality, you're probably given to some kind of system to deal with your faith. This frustration of I want to be here, but I'm not experiencing the results in my faith that I wish I could experience. And one of the ways that we do that, I see this all the time, is that some people just revert to legalism. And that's kind of a big word, but basically all it means is that you're a list maker. Any list makers in the room? We've got some list people. You're married to one. Just nudge them real quick, have them raise their hand. The list makers, we love list makers, but when you apply that system to faith, it works for a little while. You know, I'm going to do this and I'm not going to do this. And you can make that list, and maybe you've made a list through the years. And it doesn't work for a few reasons, though, because it doesn't last. It doesn't last in one regard because either you accomplish those things and you tend to become proud because you think, hey, I've accomplished something, and that's kind of self-defeating, or you've fallen short of your list one more time. You made the list. It was a few days, a few weeks, maybe a few months or a few years, and you fell off the wagon, or it didn't really pan out, and so you got to make a whole new list. And so in your phone, in your notebook, on your computer, you've got list after list of things you want to do. And at the end of the day, you still end up frustrated with your faith because the system doesn't work. Another thing that we do, some people are not list makers. These are the ones of you that did not raise your hands before, but you're experience seekers. And some of us do this with faith. We're just looking for another experience. And so we come to worship services, or we go to a Bible study, or any number of things. We listen to some songs or maybe some podcasts in the hopes that we'll feel something. And this feeling can come one of two ways. One way would be a really positive way. You come in and you get hyped up. I mean, the room's full, the music's good. Everything's happening the right way. You're just in the perfect spot. Maybe God does move and you experience something. You're excited about it. You walk out, but Tuesday comes and Thursday after that, and it feels like the feeling didn't last. And you go back to church the next week and you're like, well, maybe this week I'll feel it again. And you want that positive, that pep talk, that halftime thing where you go back out on the field and you can lay it all back out on the field one more time. And so this is like the lifeblood from you, but it's an experience-driven thing, but they don't seem to last. And whether it's positive or maybe sometimes negative. So I talk to people equally. So they're looking for an experience, but they're actually looking for a negative one. You wouldn't think that. Yeah, you think that my personality is I would come to church and I'd be looking for a positive experience. But sometimes people are coming and they want a genuine negative one. Here's what I mean. They want to feel conviction. They want to feel guilt. They don't feel any closer to God than when they're really feeling bad about everything they've done. I mean, you hear people say like that, man, I just really like it when you step on my toes, preacher. And I do a lot of that, because that's the way I roll up in here, like I'm yelling at you and stuff, I don't hear that one very much, but I do hear it some. Where people say, well, I just want to feel the weight of conviction in my life. I know that God's working in my life when I feel that. But whether it's positive or negative, it's still just experience. And once the guilt and the conviction wears off, then you're right back where you started and you're frustrated again. And some people are not legalists. Some people are not experience-driven people. They're activists, where basically, relationship with God is just about being active. And so they get involved in good causes, a lot of good things. I mean, they dig some wells, they give some money, they serve some people. And some really good things happen. But what you find even with activism, with all that there is that's good about it, you come back to yourself. And oftentimes the activism doesn't even last. You fed some people, sure. You gave some money, of course. And some good things happen. But what about what's happening inside me. And so at the end of the day, whether you're a legalist or you're an experienced person, you're driven by that, or you're just, man, let's just get active, all of us would say that any one of those systems at some point fail us. And so for us, what we have to look at is we have to ask the question, well, if these systems don't work, and if I'm frustrated with the results of my faith, then what is the solution? So what we're going to look at today is we're going to diagnose some things. We're going to try to see, if nothing else, what the problem is, so that in the coming weeks we can begin to unpack the solution a little bit, to lay a roadmap for what's really going on inside of us. Because what I'm going to assert to you today is that maybe what we need is not a system, but we need a person. Maybe what we need is not a list of to-dos, but we need a relationship. Maybe what we need is not another experience, but we need someone. And maybe what we need is not just activism alone, but maybe we need someone that's at the center that's driving and fueling all of our effort. So we're going to pick up in Ephesians chapter 4. You just heard the passage read. We're about halfway through the book. And Paul's been talking about a lot of things, and today he's going to set the course for this pivotal idea about how we can actually begin to remedy this tension that we all feel at some point between the reality of our faith and the hope of our faith. And this is how he begins. Watch what he says. He says in verse 17, so I tell you this, and I insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do. Now, I highlighted the word so, a little bitty word, a lot of important significance to that. Obviously, we can't preach 3 chapters to get into this 4th one. But basically, everything that Paul has been saying for 3.5 chapters, he's now going to tell you, here's how all that matters to you. Here's when you're looking at the frustration between the reality, this tension of your faith. Here's now what all that means when you want to appropriate the change that seems so elusive in your life. And he says, so based on everything I've said before this, now I'm going to insist on some things. These are some things that are going to be really important to you if you don't want to live just a continual life of frustration. And he uses this phrase that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do. Now, you don't hear the word Gentiles very much in public, but basically all that means from a biblical perspective is the word ethnos. It means that you're from a group of people that were not Jewish people. So basically, if you could divide all the world's population down into Jewish people and non-Jewish people, that would be the Gentiles as the non-Jewish people. Now, this is important because if you've been with us, you know that this is an ironic statement from Paul. And the reason saying that is because, do you remember who he's talking to? Anybody? Well, in case you need a reminder, just flip back one page. In chapter 3, he says this, for this reason I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ Jesus, for the sake of who? Who? You Gentiles, right? So he's talking to Gentiles. But he'd also said it in chapter 2, verse 11. He said, therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth. And so this is kind of ironic, isn't it? In chapter 4, he's telling them, hey, don't be Gentiles, but he's just been telling them, hey, I'm talking to you Gentiles. It'd be kind of like the same thing as if you're an American in the room today, of me saying, hey, listen, I know you're American, but stop acting so American, okay? Don't be yourself. And you're like, well, I don't know how to do that because this is all I know. This is what I've grown up in. This is how I operate. It's how I think, because we know this, right? That our culture, what we've come up in, affects how we see things. It changes our perception of reality. It affects how we make decisions, how we see relationships, how we see ourselves. And so basically, what is he saying here? He's saying, listen, I know you're Gentiles, but I don't want you to act like it. I've given you a new identity. I've talked about this new humanity. And so now I want to tell you how you begin to live like a new person. That's what he says, right? In chapter 4, verse 17. He says, you no longer live as the Gentiles do. So this transition that's taken place is the crux. It is the point of tension in all of our lives. How do you begin to live in a different way? If I'm not supposed to live that way, I'm supposed to live a new way, then how do I do that? Well, the first thing you have to understand is, well, what does it mean to live like the Gentiles do? What is he actually talking about? This is the diagnosis of the problem. And he diagnosed the problem. He describes it in the rest part of in verse 17 and 18. And this is how he describes the problem. See if this doesn't resonate with you. It says, in the futility of their thinking, this is how the normal default position for all of us is. In futility of their thinking, they are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. So the first phrase he puts up there is in the futility of their thinking. Futility just means empty, right? It just means that you're working towards something, hoping for a different result, and you think that this will deliver on some kind of promise, but it never really fulfills the promise. I think it will, but it won't. So what are some of the ways, some of the patterns that we see this surface in our life? Well, I'm gonna point out 4 because I think they connect with everybody in here. There's some things that we think will promise us something, but very rarely fulfill what they promise. First one I see, especially in our culture today, is we're all seeking comfort. Comfort basically just means to minimize pain and loss and maximize pleasure. You've seen this in a lot of different ways. You've probably recognized this in your own life. You're just generally seeking comfort. You want a more comfortable lifestyle, so that means a little bit more money in your bank account, a little bit better job. Maybe you're single and you're like, man, I just want to experience a little bit more pleasure over here. I want to date someone. I want to marry someone. Or maybe you're married and you're like, I want a little bit more comfort, and so I want to not be married, And so you're wrestling with all these things in your mind, but the reality is that all of us, we want to minimize pain. We want to minimize loss, and we want to maximize our experience of pleasure. And we think that if we can do that, then we can be fulfilled. This is the default position in our minds. This is what we all think. But it's not the only one. Some of us seek comfort, but you've probably noticed that you also seek sometimes in your life power. You want to minimize weakness, and you want to maximize strength. This means that you want to move up the corporate ladder. You want to be a little bit better in an area. You want to have a better this or that. You want to get in a position where you can make more decisions, and you have to be responsible. You don't have to be as responsible for somebody else making decisions for you. You want to maximize your strength. You want to grow. And the hope is that as you move up, as you get older, that you will become fulfilled. But how many of you have experienced this or know someone that has? The promises of prestige and power that you hoped you would attain didn't deliver on their promise. It was futile. It was empty. You thought it would fulfill, but it didn't come through. Well, if those don't resonate, what about this one? Approval. You want to minimize rejection, and you want to maximize affirmation. We are a culture addicted to affirmation. If you don't think so, those of you that are Instagram people or Facebook people, I feel like there's probably 2 groups in here. Some of you are Facebookers, some of you are Instagrammers. I don't even know if that's a correct word or a phrase for it or a description, but here's what I do know is that if you're on those outlets, it's very easy. You post a picture or you make a post, you make a statement on there, and you don't just throw it out there into the void and say it. The reason you're putting it out there oftentimes is because you want to elicit a response. And so you'll put something out there, it's your deepest thought, about something going on in the world, whether it be political or spiritual or just life in general, or a picture of you on vacation or a picture of your dining experience. Please stop doing that, by the way, all right? You'll take a picture of your food and say, hey, this is what I'm eating today, and you'll put it out there. But here's what you do. You put it out there into the void, and then you leave it, put your phone in your pocket or whatever, you pull it back out, and 5 minutes later, because you want to see how many people have double tapped that picture, have hit the little like button, and you will judge whether or not you are affirmed, whether you've found approval by how many people respond. And this is kind of the vice or the disease of our culture, is we've got more friends, we've got more experiences, but we are an approval and affirmation starved culture. And if we can get a little endorphin rush from a little heart at the bottom of our picture, if we can have 100 likes rather than 50, if we can have 1,000 rather than 500, then somehow we feel better about ourselves. But just like comfort doesn't last, and just like power doesn't last, approval doesn't last. You can minimize it all you want, but you can't escape it. And then the last one I'm going to point out is this. This is futile thinking, control. It means you want to minimize uncertainty and you want to maximize predictability. You figured out that you can't always be comfortable. You figured out that you can't always be strong. You figured out that not everybody approves of you. But so what do? You revert to control. I just want to create a predictable, sustainable environment. It's me and mine. I've got my job. I've got my own car. I've got my own stuff. I've drawn a circle around myself. I just want things to be predictable because it feels safe. This is futile thinking. Because you realize that you can't outrun loss. You realize you can't outrun pain. Every single one of us, our default position, the system we choose, whether it's legalism, whether or not it's experiences, whether or not it's activism, none of them can answer the problems of our own futile thinking for very long. And so if this is the case, then what Paul's saying is we've got a deep problem, don't we? If we're all prone to this, if we all have futile thinking, and if we're all trying to implement systems that don't work, then this is a huge problem for us personally, and it's a huge problem in our culture. I would dare say that if we were to sit down together in your life and we were talking about the frustration you have with your faith, probably in 30 minutes' time, it would probably come back to one of these 4 areas. And if you were going to counsel me, if we were going to sit down over coffee and you were going to say, hey, Dan, what's going on in your life? And I was to be honest with you and say, hey, I'm frustrated with my faith. I'm frustrated with my experience and the reality of what I profess. You would probably at some point take me down a road and we would arrive back at the point that we started with, one of these 4 areas in our life. Because our futile thinking leads us down paths that are destructive. And so if you're wondering why you're disillusioned, if you're wondering why you're disenchanted with faith, if you're wondering why it's disheartening sometimes, this whole thing is maybe we're implementing systems that don't really answer the core of our problem. This has always been the problem. This has always been the case. Matter of fact, this is not even the first time Paul mentions this. He actually says almost the exact same thing in his letter to the Romans. In Romans chapter 1, verse 21, you could read the whole chapter. We're going to just take a snapshot. And he talks about this condition that we're all in. He says, for although they knew God, that means you can look around and say, okay, man, there's something that created all this stuff. It says that they neither glorified him as God nor gave him thanks, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. See, futile thinking will lead to foolish living. You think it's going to promise something and it's going to pan out this time. You're going to go to that well one more time. One more relationship, one more click, one more bite, one more drink, one more prayer experience, just a religious one. And you think that somehow that's going to fix the problem. But here's the deal. It's futile thinking and your hearts are darkened. But he says the problem's even deeper than that. Verse 23, what does he say? You exchange the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. You're like, well, I haven't ever done that, okay? I don't remember an art class making some kind of art piece and bowing down and worshiping. I mean, that's primitive, right? That's primitive to worship birds and animals and reptiles and images. We're way too sophisticated for that. Yeah, we're so sophisticated that we've created things to worship that don't look like birds, and they don't look like animals, and they don't look like reptiles. They just look like us. We've created things that are just mirror images of ourselves so that we could worship our own desires. And futile thinking that leads to foolish living, the deceit of that is that it always ends up in the same place. We've exchanged something. There's a transaction that's taken place. Now, if I was going to offer you something and say, hey, man, would you trade me? We used to do this as kids. Even as a kid, a sixth grader, you would look at the things, like you look at whatever it was you're trading, whether in the old days it was baseball cards. I don't even know what you trade today, but back in the day, you would look at it and say, okay, is what I have in my hand worth what you're going to give me in exchange? And you would make a decision, wouldn't you? Say, well, I would rather keep what I have, or I will give you this in exchange for what you have, and I will let go of one, and I will receive the other. But for us today, we're making those kind of decisions all the time. Every single second, we're making transactions in our brains. We're making transactions with our hearts, and by default, we're making transactions with our lives. We're exchanging created things for the Creator. And so if our problem is that we have this futile thinking, and if it is that our understanding is messed up, it's just foolish, and we think we understand, but in the end we become fools, then where does that actually come from? Well, back in chapter 4, he actually tells us where all that originates. You see it at the very end. He says that you're separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that's in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Now, this is interesting because common logic would say, well, your bad thinking precedes your heart, right? But what he says is it's an inverse of that. It's flipped, that your wrong thinking actually has a source, that there's a source for the way that you think. This is what Paul was talking about, right? Like your default position is like, this is just, you're set on default. This is what you're going to want every time. And this is not unique to you. This doesn't make you a particularly bad person or unique in any respect. This just means that you're human. You're of the old humanity. It means that you have a hard heart. This word hard, it actually is the idea of a bone that was broken and it had been restored and become calcified, and the new deposits are actually more rigid and more impenetrable than the bone itself. They would talk about the fact that if you were going to, they would use this in stone building and stuff like that. They said, this is our hearts. This is where we are intuitively. We want things, we desire things, but there's a problem. We're coming from a hardened heart position. Now, why is that a problem? Well, there's a few ramifications of that, right? We're still in diagnosis stage. What's the problem with that? Well, verse 19, he says, here's the problem. Having lost all sensitivity, they've given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. Just look at those two center words there, sensitivity and sensuality. Just like we're a group of people that are addicted to comfort and power and approval and those type of things, we're a group of people that are addicted to feeling things. As a matter of fact, you'll probably pick up in the conversations, and if you're of one of the older people in here, you probably would hear this. Even if a younger person, you probably wouldn't even know this or recognize it, honestly, because we used to talk one way about things, and now kind of the vernacular is different. Here's what I mean. You used to say about things, well, I think this or I think that. But you don't hear that as much anymore. Now what do you hear? You hear, well, I feel this or I feel that. And that doesn't seem like a big deal, and maybe it's not. But I think that it does point to a distinction of where we are as a people. We've started to come to terms with that our feelings are what drives us. Feelings are reality. And for many of us, our feelings are reality. Our feelings are the sum total of what everything is that is. And so we obey our feelings. We obey our desires. They become the driver in everything that we do. This experience-driven, this approval-seeking, this comfort desiring, this power-mongering that we all have, these are all part of the old us. But this is the default position for all of us. And there's a problem with the hardening of the heart is because we're all driven by a desire for pleasure, right? We are. But the problem is that with that desire, we lose sensitivity. That means that you have to experience things multiple times to try to recapture what you experienced the first time. That's why it's always one more click. That's why it's always one more drink. That's why it's always one more relationship. Because the last one didn't last. And so this one promises something that I can't experience over here anymore, and so I need more of it. Andy Stanley, a pastor, he says it this way, that appetites are never fully or finally satisfied. And isn't that true? I mean, just public confession time this past weekend. My wife was away at a conference, speaking at a conference, and I was left home with the kids. And so I went to the store, which is always a really bad proposition. I get there, and the kids know how to manipulate me, I guess. And so they say, like, hey, can we get cookies? And I'm like, sure, we can get cookies. And so I take them home, and, we do the cookies. We cook them up and everything like that. And so we're sitting in, but guess what? The kids went to bed. Nobody sees where this is going. The kids went to bed, and I'm still up, and it was me and the cookies, all right, just me and the cookies. And I had already had 2 of these things, right, and I had made a promise to myself because I'm trying to do good about this because I'm 46 and things just happen, okay? And so I made a promise I'm not going to eat any more of those tonight because I'm trying to stay on this kind of more of a diet type of thing, if you want to call it that. And but I kept walking by the cookies. And so I said, well, I'll have one more. So I ate one more. I'm at 3. I walk out of the room. I come back in. I'm like, well, that was pretty good. 4. And they're small enough I can throw them in my mouth in case someone walks in. I'm not like chewing on one, you know what I mean? Like I eat the whole thing. Well, here's the deal. This is a public confession time. I ended up at 8 cookies, okay? All right? That's no lie. The kids, I'm sure they woke up in the morning like, I thought we bought more cookies than that. And like, well, we did, but everybody's being quiet. But here's the deal. My taste buds never told me to stop. They never told me that. They never said, I think you've had enough. No, my taste buds were screaming at me and said, hey, that's good. Have another. You know? And about 8 cookies in, I was like, you know what? I'm not feeling real good. I don't feel good. I don't feel like myself. You know, I didn't sleep good that night, all that kind of stuff. Why? Because I had 8 cookies when I needed to stop at 2. I couldn't even fulfill my own promise to myself. Because the pleasure seeking, the taste buds were in the driver's seat. Because here's what happens. When we lose sensitivity to things, then what happens is it's basically handing the keys off to our desires and say, desires drive my life. And that's why you can't stop sometimes. That's why when you get in a situation that you said you'd never get into again, a relationship you never thought you'd get into again, when you get into a circumstance you never thought you'd get into again, that's why once you're removed from it, you feel sick, you feel horrible, and you can't figure out how you got back in there. Well, basically all you did was you had lost sensitivity, you handed the keys over and say, hey, you're driving this thing. Where do you want to go? At the end of that system of thinking, losing sensitivity leads you back to a path of destruction every time. It leads you to indulge in every kind of impurity, not just one, but every kind. Why? Because you're full of greed. You're full of greed. Now, this is not just financial greed. This just means that left unchecked, your appetites, when they're driving you, then you can't stop your desires. You are hardwired with desires for relationships, for all those things we talked about up there. You're hardwired for all those type of things, and you will go after them, and it won't be until you experience the pain of it that you wonder, and you look back and you say, they didn't really taste that good. That experience wasn't that nice. That weekend, that binge, that marriage that you shouldn't have ever gotten into because you made some decisions that you shouldn't have made. All those things led you to a place where all you have is regret. Because a life full of greed and insatiable desire, when it's in the driver's seat, this is the default position for all of us. And some of us, there's a lot of collateral damage because of that. For some of it, it's been minimized. You've been able to contain the damage, but you would say, if you're honest, that inside of you, there's some real damage going on. And so what is the solution? If that's the system, if that's the problem, if that's the diagnosis, what in the world are we supposed to do? Well, he turns the corner in verse 20, and he starts to give us that little ray of hope. He says, that, however, is not the way of life that you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You know, with every temptation, there's a truth that can answer the temptation. The truth that is in Jesus is the answer. This is why it's not a system, it's a person. Like when we see Jesus, then what we do is we begin to see who we truly are. And fortunately, there's a lot of material on this in the New Testament. Basically, this is the entire New Testament, okay? But Paul talks a little bit about what they had learned, this specific group of people. And you could read a lot into this, but here is just one little snapshot of what maybe he meant in this. In verse 4 of chapter 2, he said, but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in our transgressions. It is by grace that you have been saved. So what had they learned about Christ? Well, they had learned some things. They had learned that a system wasn't going to help them. Paul would say, listen, you're not going to get better, and then all of a sudden God's going to approve of you. You're not going to make a few steps. You're not going to take one step and he's going to take 2. That it's going to take something else. Why? Because the problem is that you're dead. Like you're dead in your transgressions. You're dead in your sin. That means that there is no life in you. And so what did God do through Christ? What had they learned in Christ? That God did something from the outside in that they couldn't do from the inside out. We're always talking about that, finding yourself, going into the core of who you really are. But what What if when you look inside you, you find you and that's all there is? What if the answer to your problem, the solution to everything was outside of you? And what had they learned? That that's exactly what Christ did. God came from the outside in. And when he died the death that we deserved because we were dead in our sins and transgression, when he was brought back to life, that God didn't just raise Jesus from the dead. He gave the potential and the opportunity for you to be alive, to be raised with him, and then to be set apart, to be seated with him in the heavenly realms. Jesus wants to seat us in the position of our victory. He wants us to fight in the arena of our victory. But most of us are fighting a futile battle because we're fighting on the wrong battlefield. We're trying to use earthly techniques and systems to fix a supernatural spiritual problem. And Paul says it won't do. The diagnosis is dire. You need something, you need to be resuscitated. You need to be brought back to life. You need a resurrection. They had learned this. And so what is he saying? He says, break the system. Change the system. Go to a person. And he says that Jesus did this. He did this so that he could prove something. God says, I want to prove something to you. What did he want to prove? Well, watch what he said in verse 7. In order that in the coming ages he might show the incomparable riches of his grace expressed in his kindness to us in Christ Jesus. When he changes us and brings us back alive, he doesn't just do it to get you out of a situation. He totally gets you out of the situation. But he also does it so that we could see who he truly is. There's a lot of bad information circling about who God is. There's a lot of bad information. There's a lot, depending on who you talk to, there's a lot of opinions out there. But Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn over all creation. He's the firstborn from among the dead. And he did that in everything so that he could have the preeminence, so that he could be exalted. What does that mean? So that you could see his glory. You could actually see God for who he truly is. And so what is the best testimony for God to display who he truly is? He takes a group of dead people who can't get themselves out of their situation. They've got futile thinking. They've got darkened understanding. They've got hardened hearts. And he says, I'm going to come in and I'm going to fix all of it. And I'm doing this so that you could see the one you were created to be like and the one to be with from the very beginning. New humanity, new creation. This is what they had learned in Jesus Christ. So when Paul says that, when he says that you were taught these things, what's he saying? He says you were taught with regard to your old way of life to put off the old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. And then to be made new in the attitude of your minds. And to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. People say to me, a lot of times they'll say, like, I don't know how you preach. I don't know how you get in front of people. And I'm always saying the same thing. Well, I don't really know how to do it either because I'm scared to death every time. But, that's one thing. But here's what I'm going to say to you. The hardest sermon for me to preach is the sermon to myself. That is beyond a shadow of a doubt true. It is as hard as this is to preach to you, it is much harder for me to preach to me. It's much harder when you're in the moment to not be deceived by your desires. It's hard for me. And the reason I say that is not so that you'll look at me, but here's what I want to tell you about you. The most important sermon that you will hear is the one you preach to yourself. Because I'm not going to be there in the midst of your desire. In the midst of your temptation, it's you. And if you have not been made new in the attitude of your mind, if there is no ammunition so that you can preach to yourself what is true when your desires are trying to deceive you and saying, we want to drive, we want to be in charge. If you can't preach to yourself, then you're always going to be frustrated. And the reality for this is simple, is that just like anybody has to learn to preach on a stage, you have to learn how to preach to yourself. You have to learn. Paul says, you were taught. Can we change it? Can we say you were trained? You were trained to do this. When I was there, Paul would say, I trained you. We trained you. Remember what we learned last week? That he equips them. That means that you're prepared for a future act of service. That there's something in your future. There's something you're going to face this week. that you're going to have some ammunition for. You've got to put on the new self, which is an interesting idea. How do you take something off and put something on? Well, if you look at the wording of that, if you break it down, he says it this way. He says to put off the old self. And then he goes on and he says, and to put on the new self. Does anybody have a different translation? What does it say? Somebody else? Nobody? We're all with this translation. Wow, that's unity right there. Okay. Well, if you look at that word in Greek, it's anthropos. That means human or humanity. Remember what the series title was? New Humanity. So basically, what is he saying? He's saying, listen, well, here's what I want you to understand, is that you've got to take off that old human that you used to be. And you've got to start to appropriate what it looks like to be a new type of human, a new way of living, a new way of thinking, a new way of understanding, and you have to be trained and taught to do that. But it's going to require three primary things. The first thing you're going to have is a vision of what that is. Well, if the answer is not a system, then what's the answer? A vision is, what has God created for me? What is the life that Christ has created for me to live? And he had already said it, right? He said that he's created for you to be like Christ in true righteousness and holiness, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. What does that mean? That means that when you look at Christ, you see yourself, that he was the prototype. He was the one that was going to restore what was broken and show us how to live life. So not only does he die for us, is resurrected for us, not only does he seat us in the arena of our victory, but then he also begins to train us with a vision of what life is actually supposed to be. That means that when we look at Scripture and we look at the story of Jesus and we keep Jesus ever before our minds, that we begin to appropriate the characteristics of Jesus himself. We begin to take on the nuances of how he saw things and the way he interacted with people and the way he went through circumstances and difficulty and the way he handled and treated people that were different than him and helped the brokenness that was in the world, how he had faith and he interceded on behalf of others and how he engaged with the Father. We're able to see these things, but you can't get a vision of who you're supposed to be apart from Jesus. The other thing that's going to take is intention. You're going to have to see a picture of who he is, but then you're going to have to make the intention to say, I want to put some things in place to do that. I want to begin to appropriate that. I want to begin to take that on. I'm going to initiate activity. And if that's the case, if there's a picture where you want to go, if there's a desire to attain it, then there has to be a means by which you can accomplish it. A lot of people think that God's primary goal is to frustrate us. Is to hide from us. God came in visible form so that we could see him, so that we could know him and experience him. And so we've got a vision of him. We've got an intention. I want to do that. And now we say, like, okay, how do we do that? Well, the first thing that we have to do is we have to be ever in front of him, pursuing him. And so if we want to make the change, that we have to begin to think different thoughts. How are you going to think different thoughts? Well, you're going to have to put new thoughts in, because there's a few things that happen with our thoughts. Usually, if you've got a desire or a temptation in your life, it starts with a thought, doesn't it? It's a thought that's interjected into your mind, and then you've got a split second to catch it and to say, is that true or not? Is that the character of Christ or is it not? You're battling your feelings, you're battling your body, you're battling emotions, you're battling all these things. And so we have to catch thoughts and we have to process thoughts and we have to replace thoughts and think new thoughts. And we can't do that unless we're in God's word. We can't do that apart from what he's revealed. We can't do that outside of the community that he's placed us in as a body of Christ. We're not lone rangers out there. We're not lone wolves out there trying to do this on our own. We need the strength of other people speaking into our lives for that. And so in the process of that, the vision, the intention, and the means, he brings us all the way back. He said, this is what I taught you. I want you to be made new in the attitudes of your mind. Why? Because this old self is being corrupted. That means rot. It means that your thoughts are actually rotting your life. But just like he resurrected our bodies, and he'll resurrect our bodies, just like he resurrected our spirits, right now he wants to renew our minds. He wants to renew our minds. I was trying to think of a way to, a good illustration to end this with. And the only thing I could come up with, my mind kept coming back to a story. It's a story that we read to our kids, and maybe you've seen the movie. If you've ever watched Chronicles of Narnia, has everyone watched Chronicles of Narnia, or you read the books? Got a few of you out there. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, okay, is a story within the Chronicles of Narnia series written by C.S. Lewis. And in this particular book in the series, there's a new character that's introduced into the story, and his name is Eustace. Eustace comes alongside Edmund and some of the others. And another focal point of the story is this lion who becomes kind of like a Christ figure, for sake of time, Aslan. And he's kind of the ruler of the domain of Narnia. He's the rightful king of Narnia. Well, Eustace enters into the story, and they're on this ship, and they land on this island. And Eustace is, he's kind of the kid that nobody likes, quite honestly. He's annoying, he's selfish, he's loud, all these kind of things. Everybody rolls their eyes every time he's around. He's just really annoying. He's like who you never want to be, right? And so his character just kind of jumps off the page at you. Well, they land on this island, and he breaks off, and he goes off on his own. He gets into this cave. And in the cave, he finds a dragon slayer. And just like in any good mythological story, the dragon is guarding his pot of gold. Like it's just a cave full of gold. Well, as the dragon dies, Eustace is trying to get all of the coins, all this gold. And he's sticking it in his pockets. He's making plans, and you get to hear his thoughts. He's like, man, I'm going to take this, and I'm not going to share it with anybody. And he's trying to figure out how he's going to hoard all this wealth. And in his fatigue, in the middle of all this, he falls asleep on the gold. And as the story goes and as the page turns, he wakes up. He wakes up, and what he begins to look and realize about himself is that he's no longer a little boy anymore. He's actually become a dragon. What was a boy actually had become a monster. And he's left trapped, not knowing how to get out, because his desire and his greed has left him into a place where he is hideous, and he doesn't know where to turn and doesn't know what to do. But what's interesting about the story is if you turn the pages, you begin to find that Aslan, the king of Narnia, the lion, is not resigned to leave even Eustace, this annoying, selfish, greedy boy, in the midst of his prison, caused by his own greed and his own desires. And so as we finish up, what I want to do is something a little different. I've never actually done this before. Well, I have, because I had a 9 o'clock service, so never mind. As I'm going to read to you the transformation of Eustace. Because I think what C.S. Lewis does here in narrative form is he describes what we all hope to experience. And he speaks to the tension that we're all in because we're all trapped by our own desires. And if you don't like this reading, you can pick it up for yourself. I bought this for $4. So get you a copy of it, or go to your local library. They're awesome too. Listen up. This is Eustace talking about his experience of transformation with Aslan. I looked up and I saw the very last thing I expected. A huge lion coming slowly toward me. And one queer thing was that there was no moon last night, but there was moonlight where the lion was. And so it came nearer and nearer. I was terribly afraid of it. You may think that being a dragon, I could have knocked any lion out easily enough, but it wasn't that kind of fear. I wasn't afraid of it eating me. I was just afraid of it, if you can understand. Well, it came close up to me and looked straight into my eyes, and I shut my eyes tight. But that wasn't any good because it told me to follow it. You mean it spoke? Edmund said. I don't know. Now that you mention it, I don't think it did, but it told me all the same. And I knew I'd have to do what it told me. And so I got up and I followed it. And it led me a long way into the mountains. And there was always this moonlight over and around the lion wherever we went. And at last, we came to the top of a mountain I'd never seen before. And on the top of the mountain, there was this garden, trees and fruit and everything. And in the middle of it, there was a well. I knew it was a well because you could see the water bubbling up from the bottom of it. But it was a lot bigger than most wells, like a very big round bath with marble steps going into it. The water was clear as anything, and I thought if I could get into it and bathe, it would ease my pain in my leg. But the lion told me I must undress first, mind you. I don't know if he said any words out loud or not. I was just going to say that I couldn't undress because I hadn't any clothes on, when I suddenly thought that dragons are snaky sort of things, and snakes can cast off their own skin. Oh, of course, I thought. That's what the line means. And so I started to scratch myself, and my scales began coming off all over the place. And then I scratched a little deeper. And instead of just scales coming off here and there, my whole skin started peeling off beautifully, like it does after an illness or if I was a banana. In a minute or two, I just stepped out of it. I could see it lying there beside me, looking rather nasty. It was the most lovely feeling. And so I started to go down into the well for my bath. But just as I was going to put my feet into the water, I looked down and I saw that they were all hard and rough and wrinkled and scaly, just like they had been before. Oh, that's all right, said I. It only means I had another smaller suit underneath the first one. And so I have to get out of it too. And so I scratched and I tore again at this underskin, and it peeled off beautifully, just like the first. And I stepped out of it and left it lying beside the other one. And I went down into the well for my bath. Well, exactly the same thing happened again. And I thought to myself, oh dear, how many skins have I got to take off? For I was longing to bathe my aching leg. And so I scratched away for a third time and got off the third skin, just like the two others, and I stepped out of it. But as soon as I looked at myself in the water, I knew it had been no good. And then the lion said, but I don't know if he spoke it, you will have to let me undress you. I was afraid of his claws, I tell you, but I was pretty nearly desperate now. And so I just lay flat on my back and I let him do it. The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone straight into my heart. And when he began to pull off the skin, it hurt worse than anything I'd ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of peeling the stuff off. You know, if you've ever picked a scab off of a sore place, it hurts like Billy. Oh, but it is fun to see it coming away. I know exactly what you mean, said Edmund. Well, he peeled the beastly stuff right off, just as I thought I had done it myself the other 3 times. Only when I did it, it hadn't hurt. And there it was, lying on the grass, only ever so much thicker and darker and more knobbly looking than the others had been. And there was I, as smooth and soft as a peeled switch, and smaller than I had ever been. Then he caught hold of me. I didn't like it that much, for I was tender underneath now that I had no skin on. And he threw me into the water. It smarted like everything, but only for a moment. After that, it became perfectly delicious. And as soon as I started swimming and splashing, I found that all the pain had gone away from my arm. And then I saw why. I turned into a boy again. You'd think me simply phony if I told you how I felt about my own arms. I know there's no muscle on them and pretty moldly compared to Caspian's, but I was so glad to see them back. After a bit, the lion took me out and he clothed me. He dressed me. He dressed you with his paws? Well, I don't exactly remember that bit, but he did somehow or another, and in new clothes, the same I've got on now, as a matter of fact. And then suddenly I was back here, which is what makes me think it must have just been a dream. No, it wasn't a dream, said Edmund. Why not? Well, there are the clothes for one thing, and you have been, well, undragoned for another. I like that story on a lot of levels, but one particular one is that sometimes in church we paint the picture that change is as easy as taking a shirt off and putting on a new shirt. Take off our old self, put on our new self. But the reality for us is simply this, is that change is hard and change hurts. And change is not something you can do by yourself. It is going to take someone that can do it for you. And just like Eustace in that story had the lion Aslan do what he could not do, healed him up, made him new. You have one that has gone to the mats for you. You and I have one that has paid the penalty and made the sacrifice so that you could be made new. And so for some of us in the room, that's a reminder. For some of us, it's a whole new thing. But for all of us, it's a reminder that change happens over time. Matter of fact, the story ends this way. I'll put it up here for you. It says, it would be nice and fairly nearly true to say that from that time forth, Eustace was a different boy. To be strictly accurate, he began to be different boy. He had relapses. There were still many days when he could be very tiresome, but most of those I shall not notice because the cure had begun. So the question for us today is, what is the real cure? A system won't do it, but there is one who sacrificed. And so the sacrifice is made available to you. So what I'd like to do today, just to finish up, is I'd like to give you just a second to pause. We're going to take communion in just a few minutes, but I'd like for you to pause for a second. And maybe you've got questions about that. Maybe you're frustrated and disillusioned and tired. And what God would want to invite you into today is just a period of rest and peace. And he would want to do for you what you could not do. And so if you bow your head and close your eyes. And if you would begin just to pray to God and say, God, I don't want to be like the old me. I want to take the old me off. And I want you to put the new me on. And if you would ask him to do that, he'll meet you right where you are, and he'll begin the process, and he'll begin to teach you a new way to live.